Hello, and welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. And this month, True Mr.FOoT has requested a discussion about Mamerica, Tip's hat. Yes, my experience of America, where I live. It's very hard not to put my cards on the table really early about how I feel about this. Mr. Root says, "Oh boy, is it July." Ah, yes, July. A very distinct month in America. And that means parlay. Mr. Fruit says, "I will start with the question and give some context afterwards. What does America mean to you? As in, what is your relationship to your home country? What does it feel like to look outwards to the rest of the world? Is it the greatest country in the world, as many Americans claim? No. And what is it that would make a country the greatest country in the world?" Okay, so just to briefly pause, we have kind of three topics to tackle. What's my experience of America, kind of including a bit separately what does it the outside world look like to me living in America, and also what would make a country the greatest country in the world, since America obviously isn't that. Which we're not going to justify. It just isn't. It just clearly isn't. Of course, we'll talk about that. I would never be that dismissive, but I there's no secret about how I feel about America. It's not a good place. But we will, of course, talk about why I think that. And there's some context too. So we're going to read that. But remember, those are our questions. I will come back to them once we finish with the context. Mr. Fruit says, "One of my favorite creators on YouTube is Channel 5 with Andrew Callaghan. Callaghan? Formerly known as All Brakes No Gas. All Gas No Brakes. Whoops." Andrew travels across the US with his crew, interviewing all kinds of interesting people, participating in social gathering, political rallies, and conventions. All he does is ask them what's on their mind, and they begin to talk. And by the way, Mr. Fruit says, "I do mean all kinds of people, from normal Joes and Janes to radical communists, to right-wing conspiracy theory propagators, to people unsure what they are even protesting." I think I have seen this before. Anyway, from my German European perspective, remember this is Mr. Fruit, not me, America often seems like an alien planet. Right on. While there are undoubtedly many similarities, you have to deal with problems that don't really exist here. Obviously, Channel 5 does not represent all Americans. A lot of the stuff these people tend to say is emotionally charged and easy to dismiss. But what I love and what keeps me coming back is that there's often something true in what these people say. It usually happens without them even noticing. And Mr. Fruit attached a clip that's an example of that. I won't comment on it. I'll just link it in the description. And if you'd like to take a look, it's a very brief, like 1 minute, someone talking about what they think freedom means in America. Pretty interesting. Go take a look if you like. I'd like to briefly back up slightly. I think that sentiment is really interesting, Mr. Fruit. The whole thing about people, there's like a grain of truth in even very misguided sentiments from folks, I think is a really interesting idea. In game design, we often talk about how your audience knows what's wrong with a game, but not how to fix it. If people don't like something in a game, a ton of people don't like this thing, they're likely not wrong. They might just be, their solution probably won't be good. You should listen to their negative feedback, but not to what they recommend doing about it most of the time. That's a very oversimplified, good piece of game design advice. And games go awry when they follow the player's suggestions about what to do about that too much. I'm not saying players never have good suggestions, but if you took all of them and pulled one at random out of a hat, it would be a bad one a vast majority of the time. Players are not good game designers. Some of them are, but mostly they're not. I think that's true here. Your average person doesn't have a skilled, developed ability to say what they think, to express what they mean, to be careful about the implications of using language the way that they are. Your average person is bad at communicating, really bad, in my opinion. And the interesting thing about that is that they have a point, though. It's just not being expressed in a way that, like, without some introspection, really makes that much sense, which I think is a really interesting insight. I thought that was really cool. There's a spoilered out part at the end, but just to conclude, Mr. Fruit says, "Political topics are always hard, and there's no need to go into minute details or in-length arguments about things." And Mr. Fruit did ask me, is it okay if I request this parlay? Is that all right with you? Which I really appreciate. I can do this kind of parlay because I am allowed to say no if I don't want to do it. But I feel you were really understanding. I feel perfectly comfortable when you ask it that way. So thank you. There's a spoilered out part, but we'll come back to it later. So again, the question we're going to start with is, what does America mean to me? I'm going to answer this in kind of 3 steps. The first thing I'm going to do is try to tell you what I think my experience of America has been. I'm going to do that, but I'd like to note, and my whole shtick with this parlay is I think that where culture and people resonating or holding onto their culture kind of goes wrong is where they foolhardily assume that they know what the rest of the world is like when they claim things about their own experience. So I'm going to tell you some things that to me are America. But a lot of those things are things that you could surely experience elsewhere. I just don't know that. Like, I don't know. I don't know if these things are American. How could I? I would have to know everything about everywhere in the world, you know? And I think that there's an egocentrism in America that I believe comes from people looking at their relatively varied surroundings. I wonder if America actually is relatively diverse, but maybe it is, and I think people think it is. And they look at that and they say, so I do know what other people are like. And so that means like I know what's up. And so my experience is like verified or correct in some way. And like, no, it isn't. But just because I don't really experience that as being like my American culture, I don't look around and think like this is my cultural experience. I think I've had basically no cultural experience. But that's ridiculous, of course. I have. I just maybe don't notice because it's my immediate surroundings. So let's try to find out what it is, instead of me just dismissively saying, I don't have any experience of America. America doesn't exist in my mind. Let's try to parse it out. So that's how I'm going to start. Does that make sense? And I don't really know or care if any of these things are true. It doesn't matter. I'm just telling you, this is the experience I had. I'm not trying to claim anything about it. I don't care if it doesn't matter if it's wrong. I'm not trying to lay down any facts about things about America. This is just me, okay? All right. Yeah, a big one that comes to mind is like infrastructure and driving and states and the highways. So I've lived in Massachusetts for a lot of my life, which is on the northeastern part of the United States, below Maine, relatively near Canada. I almost said Europe. I guess it is. It's near Vermont. It's near New York, relatively. We're in that little area, right? And Massachusetts has a thing called the Mass Pike, which is a horizontal highway that kind of lances, I guess that's where the name comes from, inland. And it's really long, it's very straight, it's pretty efficient. It's often remarkably uncrowded, although it's other times it's a traffic nightmare. But at certain times of the day, it's remarkably usable, and you can very efficiently get halfway across Massachusetts, a pretty long boy state, in like a cool 45 minutes. It's an interesting part of Massachusetts, right down the middle. And so like between Boston, and people know Boston, this coastal, large city, very convoluted, structured city, and Worcester, which is kind of in the middle-ish of Massachusetts. I think a really crappy city. When I lived there, I had a bad experience, but what are you gonna do? I don't know. There is this route, very distinct, landmark or kind of dividing line that cuts Massachusetts sort of in half, you might say. And my experience of there being like relatively good public transit, buses, trains, train lines into Boston, and then trains from Boston to other, like New York, for example. And then also good driving routes, like relatively efficient driving. And you can just pull off the side of the road every few miles, and there's like a place to stop, take a piss, get a snack. Sometimes there's like literally restaurants or at least fast food and relatively clean restrooms, like not clean, but what you're picturing, it's better than that, just not good, but not like you. Anyway, they're better than you might expect. That's all I'm gonna say. It's not great. Don't get me wrong. Ain't no luxury, but it's kind of nice. And being able to, I hate driving. I hate it. But having there be that like relatively pleasant experience. Like overall, I think there are some decent amenities, is what I'm trying to say. And the GPS will occasionally send you way off the road, and you get into the weeds, and you're now at an IBM processing facility with like 50 abandoned delivery trucks. Are you even allowed to be here? And your music switches to some like hardcore metal, and they're screaming about the age of Aquarius or some cryptic bullshit. And then a police car drives by, and you're like, oh my goodness. And they roll down the window, and they're all smiles, and they're like, oh yeah, another one of those. You get out that way, and you're like, thank you, please don't sue me. And then you know, go back down. And the music is going, Age of Aquarius. And you're like, what's happening? Stop. Put me back on the highway. Why did the GPS tell me to go here? And you've had this very involuntary adventure. And then you run out of gas like 5 miles down the highway. You pull off, well-meaning, into some town with a population of 100 people that you'll never hear from again. And their one gas station is in like a super convoluted place. So you drive around the entire town, and you get all turned around. It becomes a half-hour excursion. You use more gas than you would have if you just kept going, and you're worried you're going to run out in this totally random place. And the GPS kind of loses signal, and you stop by the side of a lake with the guardrail on the side, and you're kind of looking out of the lake, and it's like, this is really beautiful. Where am I? What was I doing? Oh yeah, I'm lost. I'm gonna get stranded here. And then you figure it out like 1 minute later, and there was never really any danger, and you get back on the road. That, to me, is the thing I would remember about this place. Again, I don't know if that really is that Massachusetts-y or America-y, but states, that's another thing. Having this collection of like not quite different countries reminds me a little bit of the EU has that thing, the Schengen area. It's named something like that. I don't know. I'm not qualified to talk about this, but the EU has a thing where you can like go between EU member countries relatively freely, and it's a lot like moving between states in the United States, relative to moving between other countries anyway. It's a lot like that. And they, having really different laws. Here in Massachusetts, for example, we have cannabis is legal, and it's very easy to buy. It's, not cheap, but it's easy to buy. And we're surrounded by states where it isn't legal, but it's so absurdly easy to get here and then leave with, right? That in practice, there's that weird relationship. I believe a lot of those states, actually, it's like legal to have a little bit, because it would just be ridiculous to enforce like, oh no, you brought a chocolate bar and drove across the border. Drove across the border with like a tiny amount of cannabis or whatever. So I think it is actually legal to have a very small amount. Not exactly qualified on this topic again, but that is kind of distinct to me. Like, you move relatively large distances to relatively different places like it's nothing on a regular basis. That's a distinct thing, I think, about the United States. Massachusetts is pretty, it can be kind of pastoral. Things are not super far away, but there's a lot of really good places to walk. There's a lot of beauty. There's a lot of trees. These bower passages that have like the trees hanging high, but creating kind of a tunnel over them. Just really pretty. Like a lot of roads are like that here. That's beautiful. A lot of very good public places to walk around or explore or hike or whatever. That's great. Yeah, I don't know. Those are mostly the things, I guess. One thing I really don't have, as that I know that seems like a limited, oddly driving focused thing that I find distinct about America, but that's what I've got. That's the thing that comes to mind. Some things I really don't have, as I move into the second part of my discussion about this, are like food culture. I don't remember growing up with any like distinct food that was like my kind of basic food. And then, have you seen the internet? People cook a whole bunch of stuff nowadays. That's normal. But for a lot of people, it'd be like they grew up in Japan, and so they've got their staple like miso shiru and the tamagoyaki omelet rolled thing, and their steamed rice with natto, and their like kind of core breakfast thing, right? And they've got their oyakodon and all these dishes that are kind of the modest core of their cuisine that they probably eat their whole life. And then, yeah, like 80% of the other things they eat are a whole bunch of stuff from all over the place, basically just from the internet, but pretty global cuisine. I reckon people who, to be polite, don't live under a rock nowadays, generally eat that way. I think the difference with me, because I'm going to go on to say that I don't think I am a very culture person. Like I have less of a culture than other people. And what I mean by that is stuff like, for me, there is no core cuisine like that. Even if I did once have it, I don't eat it. I don't cook it. All the things that I eat are things I like manually added to my rotation of foods. That's a personality thing with me. Like I just do that. It's build craft, obviously. Um, but I don't have that kind of core that is like the food I grew up with. Or again, at the very least, I don't eat it. I don't eat anything from my childhood, really. Or I've reinvented it. It's not like and it's not because like my mom, for example, is a bad cook. She's a great cook. It's not like I can't tell you things she's served me that I really liked. It still influences my cooking, but not in the way that I have this kind of cultural core of food. Does that make sense? And this is how I perceive a lot of things about myself. Again, as I said earlier on, it's important to stress that I don't have any way to know if that's actually true. It could be that things that I take so for granted that they become invisible to me are actually very culturally specific things, but I just don't know. My perception, and of course for a few things like cuisine, I feel like I can say pretty definitively, is that these things are not like a cultural artifact I grew up with or kind of had to start. In my perception, essentially all of the things are things I got from the outside. They were not things I started with and then went out into the world with. Does that make sense? So now I'd like to go in kind of an odd direction for a few minutes. I want to tell you a little bit about my background. I don't care about this part of myself very much, but I think you might find it interesting. I would like to say, and this will make sense in a minute, please don't, interpret this too straightforwardly. I'm going to tell you this and then you're going to think, yeah, like that's the kind of person I would expect to have the opinion you just said, to feel like they had kind of no culture. But let's engage critically with this. Yeah, I'm sure that correlates. I'm sure it's not unrelated to my upbringing, my youth or whatever, my origin story, why I think this way about culture. Basically, that to me, it just isn't really a part of my life. It's a bit weird to me that people value culture and family and like blood and where you came from so much. To me, it's like, why? Those are things that you didn't choose. The things that were decided for you define you? What? Like, that's just very alien to me. Super weird. I don't relate to that or much of anybody in my life, in my surroundings at all. They all care about that a lot, and I don't care about it almost at all. Why would you, from my perspective? But that may simply be because I don't really have it. I certainly have a family. I don't not care about my family members, but I care about them because they're my friends, not because they're my family members. That isn't a thing about them. I care about them because they're nice people, not because I'm supposed to care about them. I don't care. And you might call that irreverence, and you feel free to judge me that way. That's up to you. Anyway, so I'm going to tell you this thing, but I'd like to really engage with like, what does this mean for me being this way and being kind of culturally agnostic, if you wanted to say it that way. Okay. I was adopted. You probably saw that one coming, the way I was talking about this. My birth mother was pregnant in high school, and so pretty normal that you would not raise the child at that age. It seems that she carried me for religious purposes. It seems like it would have made a lot of sense, maybe, to get an abortion. Whatever your views on that, whatever my views on that, it maybe ironically resulted in my birth, that she didn't feel that was an option. This is what I've been told anyway. And she also didn't tell the adoption agency who my biological father was, possibly because they wanted to avoid complications, or maybe it was like a hookup or something. She said it was on a lifeguarding job. Interesting. And that he wasn't even around anymore. That's not uncommon with adoptions, so that might not be true. We don't know. Anyway, she is fairly full-blooded Irish, and I've done genetic testing before because it can be quite troublesome not to know your biological parents' like health conditions, right? and I have some pretty severe food allergies, among other things. And I've learned that my father seems to have been significantly Italian. You know, for what it's worth, for someone who doesn't relate to their culture, if I even have such a thing at all, I do think I look vaguely Irish and Italian in a kind of stereotypical way. Don't you think? I don't know. Anyway, especially Irish. Like, I think I have a pretty expected appearance for, like, sure, he's 50% Irish or whatever. I don't know. But anyway, that's maybe interesting. I don't think it is, but I bet some of you think it is. And my parents, I was adopted in Massachusetts, and my parents were, you know, here. And I think my mom and dad have done a great job, by the way. I'm going to say that my childhood was, I think, pretty unremarkable. My parents, a good thing is that there were really no values that were kind of like pushed on to me. I never felt like there was like a default thing I was supposed to think. That's partially me. Like, I've always just been like vehemently against, like, I just think society's values have not proven themselves to be useful. Like, the world around me isn't designed to make humans happy. Why should I think highly of it? It seems bad for everyone. Like, in every way, it's so bad. I understand why it's this way, but it's not good. Like, why do things that way? But part of that is that my parents did a good job of, you know, not overly pushing any ideas on me. Anything that they did, I think it's like, okay, it's a judgment call though. Like, maybe your kid should care about, you know, staying in school and keeping up with that. I don't think that was necessary for me, and it added some pressure that I think was negative. But how are they supposed to know that? And I don't think they did that disingenuously. So for what it's worth, I think they did a great job. But I had a very, I'm going to say, neutral childhood upbringing. It didn't affect my viewpoints much directly. Now, this is the point where you probably see what I meant before. That type of upbringing, or even just the word cloud of like adopted, northeastern United States, basically liberal, stereotypically liberal United States. I hate the terms liberal and conservative so much. If you think you know what people mean by those things, people so often talk past each other with those terms, but obviously that's what people are thinking. Fine. You know, I went to a liberal arts college, and I, you know, didn't have a particular religion in my life, etc. Like, obviously that feels related, to put it politely, to my attitude about culture and the United States. This is not an unusual or uncommon stance for people that have had that experience, right? This is not a unique thing about me. Many people would at least say they've felt this way. And I do feel like I have a bit stronger of an experience like that, but there's really no way to know that. Who knows? I don't think this is something special about me. Probably a lot of people my age that grew up with some of those parameters can relate to that experience, or they at least think they can relate to the experience I think I've had. Who knows? I hope you see what my point was with that, right? That I don't really know if that's my experience of my culture. I feel like I had a minimally cultural experience of the United States, and I don't really perceive there as being any qualities to the United States, at least positive qualities. I've had some very positive, or I perceive as distinct, experiences in the United States, which I tried to talk to you about a little earlier. And I will say a few more now before we get into, like, what would a good country be? What does it feel like looking outward? I think, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I think a lot of Americans think that the United States is more diverse than other places in the world. I think a lot of people think it's less diverse, but a lot of people might think it's more diverse. I think that. I don't know if it's true. I wouldn't die on that hill. I have no confidence in that opinion, but my default interpretation is that if you tried to get food from every culture in the world, you'd have an easier time on average doing that in the United States than elsewhere. That's a simple example. So again, I don't know if that's true. It doesn't matter if that's true. There isn't really any way to know anyway. Yeah, but let's just take it as a premise, if that's okay. I think that causes a lot of people in the US to think they kind of know the rest of the world. And as always, I think that the egocentrism in the United States that is so bad, that makes people so ignorant sometimes, weirdly, there is a grain of truth. The US is a very relevant economic existence, right? As a political entity, the US is significant, you could argue. So it would be wrong to say that the US is an irrelevant country, I suppose, right? I only wish it was, but anyhow, you see what I'm trying to say? And so my perception of other countries is that they're more specific. That's what I see when I look out at the world. The two big things are more specific, you're actually experiencing a culture that feels recognizable, and also more mature. Not very mature, but more mature. Now, I'm about to say something very disrespectful to all countries, and I want you to know, dear viewer, listener, that this is not disrespect toward you. I love the diversity of people in the world and the glorious food that they've made, the glorious food and drink and merriment of all the people in the world. I really do love that. I hold that near and dear to my heart. That is, in my mind, the entire point of humanity. The one reason not to just kill us all off this blighted planet we've destroyed is because there is a treasure that's been wrought of our disgusting use of the world, and that is our culture, I guess. But the societies that happened to arise and their current state of growth, progress, the governments of the world, I have a very low opinion of those. And how could you not, from my perspective? But that's just my perspective. And I view the United States as being like an impetulant child in a world of teenagers. Not mature countries, but more mature. I don't think that England is particularly put together from a political perspective. As I just said, I don't think any country is particularly not embarrassing from a political perspective. But they're certainly not as bad as I perceive the US as being. When I go places in the world, I've done I think, average amount of travel for my economic bracket or whatever in the United States. I've been some places, but not a ton. I particularly enjoyed Los Cabos in Mexico and Quebec in Canada. But I've been a healthy variety of places. I liked Northern England when I went there. Anyway, and when I go to those places, I feel embarrassed to be from America. I feel like it's objectively bad to be from this like pathetic place, basically. This place that has, kind of elbowed its way into being an important world power, but is just the worst from like a social or political perspective. And I think this may not actually be that true. It sure feels true to me, but it feels that way to me because I have a memory bias where when an American person does some, makes an ass of themselves in another country, I notice because like I have that stapled to my forehead, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's my perception. I don't have a lot else to say, unfortunately, about my perception of other countries. I would like to quickly insert that it might sound like I think of other countries as being like way different than the United States, and I don't. I was specifically trying to say I just think that they're more specific places. I think people overestimate how different countries are, especially how different people and what people want like are between different places. I don't think society's goal is very different in different parts of the world. I think the differences are to some degree an illusion or kind of shallow differences, not all of them. But I do think that, and my experience has been that when I go to these other places, it's a more focused experience. I feel like, yeah, I basically get what's going on here. This isn't so weird compared to my experience, but it feels more coherent. I get how people here feel like I'm from here and I had these experiences. That feels like I kind of get that, or at least I think I do a little bit. I can imagine how if I grew up there, I feel like I would have experienced that place a bit, whereas I grew up here and feel like I'd experienced not nothing, but a sort of blank slate of culture. A good mix, maybe. And I do think some of that is like the internet age and whatever. But anyway, we don't got time for this. We need to talk about what would make a country the greatest country in the world. And I think that the place to approach this from is, let's say it this way. Let's start with a flashy statement. I think that if America was taken to be sort of like its Platonic ideal, it would be a great country. There's a lot of things about the idea of America that doesn't exist, but the idea, I think a lot of people think it exists. And when people say America is the greatest country in the world, they're thinking about those things which don't actually exist, but that's what they think it is. I don't know. Or they just close their eyes so they don't notice that it isn't like that, obviously. A land of freedom and mobility and security, which it isn't, but if it was those things, that would be really good. I'm not going to, no matter how much you pay me, say that any place is the best in any meaningful way. No. But I think that states are good. The idea of like, you don't need to leave the country, and there's like 50 slightly or significantly different versions of the country within the country that you can mostly freely move between. I could just move to Seattle on the other side of the United States, like today if I wanted to. That's wild. Like that's far, you know? That's crazy. But you can do that for nothing really. Like you don't need to like ask anyone. You don't even have to tell anyone really. You know, you update your information once you're there. But I don't know, that's wild. Like I think that's good. I think that for a country to be good, it needs to cause the people who live there to be good, which no countries currently do, in my opinion, in a way that overcomes the negative of like living with a ton of humans, or modern societies are often pretty overgrown and corrupt. No current society that I'm aware of, I wouldn't know really, but this is just what I think, does this. But if a society was to be good, it would need to be designed in a way that addressed why humans can be so shitty. And none of them do, but you could, I think. And how would you do that? Well, it would be with perspective. And the idea of, that's why I started with the whole driving thing, the idea of being able to just like go places with such ease feels like a decent answer to that idea, that need, that question philosophically. I don't think America currently fulfills this, but if a country did fulfill that really well, I think that would be really good. Again, maybe the European Union isn't a country per se, but kind of does that, sort of, maybe. I don't know. I haven't used that part of the European Union. I don't know. And again, when I say America taken to its like Platonic ideal, like a lot of political problems everywhere, but in America in particular, come from, the Constitution says people should have the right to bear arms. And that, because America has such a melting pot identity, I think a lot of people, like there is, I think, less of an identity to America. So people go to the stupid piece of paper that says our identity is guns, right? Which, like, obviously that's a historical artifact that wasn't removed because government is slow. Like, it's blatantly obvious that is why that's there. It's not important anymore. It's not relevant anymore. Guns don't help you defend your family. That's not a thing. You're just endangering the people around you. The average person using a firearm in their home, you're more likely to hurt your loved ones than protect them. Just get a baseball bat, you idiot. You big nerd. Put some damage on the stack. That kind of thing, Yeah. I mean, have you heard a gun being fired? Anyway. And side note, hey, listen, I'm from the country that's all embarrassing about guns. I get to vent a little, right? That was like a minute, Anyway, moving on. Happy you are watching this just for me to say that anyway. But yeah, guns are stupid, and they don't actually accomplish anything in the modern age. And of course that's obvious, but I think that people go to the piece of paper not because people are inherently evil. They're not. People who do things that are bad are just wrong or stupid. They're not inherently bad people. If they were given more information, they would stop doing those things because those things are wrong. They are mistaken. It's not like those people have a different valid opinion that shooting and killing people is good. They're just not informed enough for it to be clear how wrong that is, I think. And when people treat other people like, it's easy to be frustrated. But it's important to remember that anybody, if deprived of enough information, would be stupid enough to think that that was a good thing to do. Like, that, the reason we don't think that's a good thing to do, and we don't think that's a good thing to do, is because we are fortunate to be informed as such. We are able to know. that's not a good thing to do. I think I would like to give people the benefit of the doubt. Now, judging people for doing bad things is fine, in my opinion, but I don't think it's because those people are like, there's some evil people or whatever. But then what could you do to make them stop now that it's gotten to this point? And so I'm not sure. But anyway, let's not talk about the death penalty anymore. What I'm getting at is simply that the United States, taken to its Platonic ideal, doesn't mean like take everything the United States says it is directly and make it the most guns or whatever, right? No, obviously not, because the United States, the idea, doesn't have anything to do with something as specific as guns. You see what I'm trying to say? And I think that the ideas are theoretically kind of good. You know, the way the United States came about, which I guess you could say a lot of things were that, but like the Revolutionary War, I don't know. I guess that's kind of complicated too. But the idea of wanting to do it on your own, kind of strike out into the world, is, I don't think, inherently bad. It just had a lot of bad results, you know? So I'm not sure. I'm not sure what it means to be the greatest country in the world or a good country, but I reckon that a lot of things about the United States actually are really good ideas for a country. They're just not currently good. In fact, a lot of them have wrapped all the way back around to being bad things about the United States. The modularity of the United States Constitution, the example of the right to bear arms thing, is an example of how that ability to add and remove things, when misused, wraps all the way back around to being a negative about the country. But it's in theory a positive thing. Like, it could be good. It just currently isn't, in my opinion. So I'm not sure what that means, but you asked, and I think the United States could be a great place. As much as I resent it and wish I had not been born here, why? Why not just Canada? It's got its own problems, plenty of them, sure, but does it need to be these? This is just the grass being greener on the other side of the fence. But that's how I do feel, as misguided as it may be. So Mr. Food does have a spoilered out part. I think this is an answer. I put the Murica thing on the screen for the whole parlay. Classic. That adds a little comedy to this dense parlay. And Mr. Foots is going to offer their take on the final question about what would make a country the greatest country in the world. I have actually spent a fair bit of time thinking about this, Mr. Food says, and I have roots in Russia, where a country's greatness was always determined by how large it was and how much its might is feared. But I disagree with that assessment. In my opinion, there's only one useful criterion. How good is the quality of life for the individual? Or in other words, do they have what they need to live a life in dignity? Interesting. I was initially disinterested. Now I have it the wrong way around with the Murica thing. Anyway. You're welcome. I'm sure that added some comedy to this parlay. Yeah, so I mean, when I said that I want a country that encourages people to be good, and that means, in as oversimplified a way as possible, a country that gives people perspective, which I guess means giving them mobility, which I guess is like states or like the European Union thing where you can go between that thing. And so I think that the best idea for a country currently existing is those. I don't think either of those is currently in any meaningful way the greatest country in the world. There is no such thing, I don't think. But if I had to say something that is the greatest, I think that thing is good in theory. I just don't think it's good in practice. And when you say, how good is the quality of life? I turn my nose up a little bit at that, because I think it's like, well, you can mitigate the damage of like our modern world just being kind of bad and making everybody horribly depressed because it's so unpleasant. And there's so many good things about life, but human society just kind of sours all of them. That's how I feel. And I think that a lot of countries with good quality of life, but they don't address the problem at all. They just damage control it significantly. A good example of this would be countries that pay for college, or like it's easier to get a lot of housing and healthcare. Like, it'd be better to eliminate the need for those epic band-aids rather than like making them easier to get is good now. But I believe that is a humble goal. Let's say it that way. But when you said, do they have what they need to live a life in dignity? That's a good example of like a person that you would say is living a dignified human life. It'd be like the freedom to advance and move around and do things and see the world. And that's part of why I think that the states thing or the European Union thing is good, because I think that that results in good quality of life. It isn't directly good quality of life, but it's indirectly fulfilling that goal. Does that make sense? This partly went a little long, but I think it's a complicated topic. In a lot of ways, I think the greatest country in the world isn't related to the topic of America, not current America anyway, which I'm sure I explained plenty why I think that during this parlay. But yeah, it is related, of course, because I do think that that thing about America is good. You know, sometimes I like to talk about why I'm an interesting person to ask this question or not. You know, I know the thing about Parley is I can comfortably, I hope interestingly, answer essentially any arbitrary question. And that's kind of the appeal of Parley in some way. I think that I am only an average, like, interesting person. I do a lot of things. I have a lot of ideas, but it's more that I'm willing to discuss them in a way that people find interesting, or like I'm analyzing them or breaking them down in a way that's satisfying, right? I think this parlay is noteworthy because this is something where I think I'm an unusually bad person to ask this question, in the sense that I have very few specific things to say about this topic. Compared to most other parlay, this was a really non-specific answer. And I apologize for that. But upon reflection, I've actually done one other take of this parlay that I didn't like that much, so I redid it. I don't have any more specific things to say, to share. I wish I did, but I really don't. So I hope that was okay. That's what I have. I guess that's in some ways a unique answer, but anyway, I just thought that was kind of interesting, noteworthy, maybe bad, but anyway, I hope you enjoyed what I did have to share. I was very happy to share it. Thank you for asking this question, Mr. Foot, in a really respectful way too. I really appreciate it.